Welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. I'm very delighted to have Paul Angone with us today. Paul is an organizational consultant, trainer, millennial influencer who specializes in helping companies attract, retain, develop, and harness the best strengths of the Millennial and Gen Z generations. He is the best-selling author of 101 Secrets for Your 20s, 101 Questions You Need to Ask in Your 20s, and 25 Lies That 20-somethings Need to Stop Believing. He also hosts the All Groan Up podcast, and groan is spelled Groan, All Grown Up podcast. And he's been featured in many publications such as Bloomberg, Business Insider, Huffington Post, and others on the unique challenges facing Gen Z and millennial generations. And today, Paul, super excited to have you here with us to share with us a little bit more about how to work with, how to lead, hire, retain, attract, all the above Gen Zs and millennials, because it is such an important topic that many of us are curious to learn more about. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm sure we're going to solve all the problems in 30, 40, 45 minutes if we're going long, but we'll get it all down.
We can do it. All right. So I would love to ask, since this is kind of a cool topic to be working in, speaking in, how did you get into this particular arena?
Yeah, actually, it was an arena I never sought out to be in. And I think sometimes that's the best arenas to be placed in, is when all of a sudden life just keeps directing you that way. And really how that worked out for me is I really just wanted to write to 20-somethings. That was my goal. Because my 20s was a hard decade of my life. I felt like I was going to go right from college, climb all the steps and enter right into my dream life. And instead, I felt like I climbed all those steps and ended up back in the basement. And there was a bunch of locked doors and long halls and a lot of wondering, what do I do now? And then I figured out, well, there's a lot of 20-somethings going through a similar experience. So that's when I started writing and researching. I went and got my master's degree in organizational leadership, but with a generational dynamic of how do generations work better together in the workplace. Because as I saw millennials struggling in the workplace, I wanted to also kind of speak into that. Mm-hmm. So 10 years goes by, I have books published, I'm speaking a lot to 20-somethings colleges, and then all of a sudden corporations started reaching out to me. And this was about 8 years ago. The first one was Goldman Sachs, reached out of the blue and says, you seem to really understand millennials, our younger adults, our younger employees. Can you help us understand them? And that really is what started the process of, okay, let me research even more. Let me do more keynotes and speaking and organizational consulting to really help fix this issue that is such an apparent issue within organizations and leadership abroad.
I'm so excited to hear this story, because I think this in and of itself is like the perfect lesson, right? Not just for 20-somethings, but for any somethings, in terms of like how to just follow the energy, right? How to trust the intuition, right? You have experiences, you're curious, and then just life brings to you that which, you're directed towards. So it's really cool that you followed the calling and that you did the work. And here you are with us today, because I work with leaders and I often hear like, Vered, how do I like communicate with, how do I like engage these people, right, in other generations different than my own, whether it's, my own being like me, right, Gen X or a boomer or whatever. So what do we need to know if we were to like dive right in for a leader? Like, what do they need to know about how to help, team members that are within the Gen Z millennial generation to be the best?
Well, first of all, you're not alone. If you are struggling with this or you're trying to better understand this, this is across industries. And so I've spoken to almost every industry around now, whether it's finance or healthcare or architects or security, software, technology. I mean, there's no companies really that aren't struggling with this issue, because it's a people issue. It's a lot of different dynamics taking place with generations coming together. And now we're seeing, Gen Z is now entering into the workplace as well. People still kind of, say, oh, those dang millennials, as if millennials are forever young. Well, millennials are getting older now. Millennials are becoming more your management now. And now it's more Gen Z who is the younger employees. And so I guess that kind of goes to where it started. And when I'm doing a keynote, one fun way that I try to lay this out for people is I'll even do a kind of a game show where I'll ask fun questions that, a name that generation game show. And I'll list out different questions that usually will stump the audience because they think it's this certain generation, but it's really another. And but what really I get to is I get to a slide that says narcissistic, self-absorbed, entitled, think they know and can be anything, and I put on there Millennials and Gen Z, because this is typically how a lot of people are struggling with these definitions of this is what it's like to work with Millennials and Gen Z. And so I lay these out on a slide, and then I have the group break up into small groups, and they discuss this. How is their experience working with Millennials and Gen Z relating to these terms? And the room gets loud, everybody gets animated, people are really getting into the conversation. And it takes me a while to bring the group back together. I'm like, man, this is like group counseling. I should be getting paid more for this. But then I say, but actually I tricked you guys. And I'll press a button and all the words will stay on my screen: narcissistic, self-absorbed, entitled, and so on. But it'll switch from Gen Z and millennials, and it'll switch to boomers. And all these words are from a 1970s essay called The Me Decade. And so for me, that's a great place to start. And it really kind of takes the audience back a little bit, because one of my arguments that I'll make is this is not necessarily a generational thing across the board. Some of it is an age thing, a stage in life, and that all of us went through, whether you're boomers or Gen X, Gen Y, millennials, now Gen Z. It's kind of an age-old tradition, right? For each older generation to say, well, that younger generation is screwing everything up. And so that's a good place to start, I think, for all of us, because I think it's also a good reminder is that all these generational terms, millennial, Gen Z, even Gen X, this is all made up. This is not hard science. We were even talking before we got on an interview that what's the date range for millennials? What's the date range for Gen Z? Well, there's about 15, 20 different working definitions of this is the date range for what a millennial or a Gen Z is. Because again, this is not based on hard science. This is a lot of different researchers arguing about what makes a millennial, what makes a Gen Z. So I'll start there as far as how we kind of wrap this conversation out into saying, maybe we're more similar than we think, but then also let's get to maybe some of the nuances and differences from there.
That is so awesome, because this is a podcast about mindset, yes, about our certain perceptions about things and how what we perceive to be true, even if it's just a story that we tell ourselves, can be manifested as our projected truth, yes. And so what a great way to start your trainings, and what a great way for us to start this podcast conversation, that how much of this is simply a story that we then manifest to be because of our behavior toward others, right? Based on how we expect them to be.
Yep, exactly. And I do think it's a good thing to remind ourselves, because we really try hard not to stereotype, especially now. I think more than ever, we're more concerned and more aware of how stereotypes, they affect our perception, like you were saying, of people. And yet, if you stereotype a millennial, if you stereotype a boomer and say, well, this is what a boomer is, this is what a millennial is, Gen X, then you can have a front page on Time Magazine and you can get up and do keynotes. So I do think we have to be aware of that, because depending on what date range you're using, millennials in the United States is about 90 million people.
Can you tell us the date ranges, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so a working definition, which I think is probably too broad, is some people will use even as vast as born between 1980 and 2000. So that's a real broad spectrum that some people will use, which is kind of crazy, because how much change did we experience within that 20-year span of time? So other people will say 1983, some might say 1985 to 1995, some might say 1985 to 1997. Some people are now saying they're Zennials. So there's a little pocket of Gen X millennials on the older side. So they're not quite millennial, they're not quite Gen X, they're Zennials. So again, it's sometimes we can get lost in some of that, but it could be between 80 to 90 million people, depending on what date range you're using. which is why we became so focused on millennials to begin with, because it's such a vast majority of people, that are now outnumbering boomers in the workplace. And then Gen X, poor Gen X, because they're sandwiched right between these two gigantic generations. And so everybody wants to talk about boomers, everybody wants to talk about millennials, and now Gen Z. And Gen X is kind of like, well, what about us? We're important too. We're people too.
So I'm so grateful again that you're bringing up this whole concept of stereotypes and, like in groups and out groups, and right, you're one of mine, and you're like me and you're not like me, because that is a big part of this. And we still need opportunities like you're offering us today to have an understanding of what are the real issues that are now going on and what can we do to create more coherence in our relationships.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Because if we never move past that and we never start shifting our mindset, and this is not just for leaders per se. And when I'm speaking, I'm really trying to be the bridge guy to bring all generations, because sometimes I'll have millennials or Gen Z in the room and it's a mixed audience of four generations. And so my whole goal is to not say Gen X boomers, this is how you must cater to millennials and Gen Z. Or Gen Z millennials, you got to toe the line and this is how you do exactly. It's trying to bring us all in the middle to just have a richer, better understanding. Because no matter what we might define as a millennial, Gen Z, or whatever, when people of different backgrounds, of different age groups, of different experience, when they're working better together in the workplace, working in teams, collaborating with each other, well, that's when there'll be a richness of experience. That's when information will be passed down. That's how leaders rise up. That's how mentorship happens. And it's so important for a vibrant organization that wants to continue to grow for these groups to come together. And so really what we have to then do is we have to do, what I call bridge the trust gap. And I would say, as we're getting to some of the factors, what's going on, I would say there's such a widening trust gap between, I mean, just American culture in general. I mean, trust is really at an anemic level. Studies are showing that, people are rating trust at all-time low levels about who can be trusted. And so really that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to get different ages to say, hey, let's build better relationships so that we can trust each other. Because if we don't trust each other, it's going to be hard to work well together.
Absolutely.
One thing that I do want to address that has affected millennials and will continue to affect Gen Z, and it's something that we can look at with hard data that I think makes a big difference in how we are perceiving 20 somethings. Because really it's a little bit of millennials, it's Gen Z, but this age demographic of what are younger employees into their 30s. Well, one is the theory of emerging adulthood. And a man named Jeffrey Jensen Arnett started researching this and calling what he saw as emerging adulthood for the last 20, 30 years. Basically, this is a theory that we're not going from adolescent to an adult nowadays. We're not making that transition seamlessly. And so what he was arguing is that there's more of an emerging adulthood. There's an elongated adulthood. And we can look at data points, and we all kind of know this, that some of the adult markers that we typically would say, well, this is what it looks like to be an adult from an external standpoint, are being delayed at great lengths than they were 30, 40, even 20 years ago. So, and again, we know this, but getting married is happening on average much later into your 20s or early 30s or late 30s or 40s. Having kids is happening much later. Owning a home is happening much later. With prices continuing to go up, it's obviously harder and harder for younger people to afford to buy a home, and maybe they don't want to. And then also just having a career, feeling like I'm in my career, that's again becoming an elongated process. And then the bachelor's degree, it doesn't hold as much weight as it did, and that's a big change. When a boomer, let's say in the 50s, got their bachelor's degree, well, that was a very high competitive advantage. That pretty much instantly brought you into a lot of different job opportunities. Well, now, I mean, the bachelor's degree is kind of like getting your high school diploma. And so now you have millennials and Gen Z who I got to get my MBA. I got to get my master's degree. I'm unemployed. I have, $50,000 in debt from my undergrad, but now I got to get an MBA and get more debt. So this elongated process, and why I bring this up, well, this is going to greatly affect 20 somethings that are working in your organization. And especially even in the terms of retention, it's going to be a lot different to retain a 20 something today that maybe is living back at home with their parents, that is not married, that doesn't have kids. And we're seeing the highest percentage of 20 somethings living back home with their parents than we've ever seen before. It's like 20 to 25% of 20 somethings that have moved back home. So if that worker, again, if that person doesn't feel like they are being successful, feel valued, they don't feel like they fit, they don't feel like they're connected to the organization, well, they're going to be much more quickly to leave. And it makes sense. And again, from just a data perspective, if you had a house and 2 kids and a wife or a husband at 24, 25, that decision was going to be a much different decision than if you're 24, 25 and you're still living at home and you see your friends traveling all throughout these images of social media, which is obviously a big thing that's defining a generation. Well, they're going to be quicker to leave. So I do like to bring that up to kind of, again, paint that picture of, okay, this is something that's a little bit different that we've seen, and it's going to keep progressing. I think, and these gaps are going to get wider and wider of younger generations doing what we call, typical adult things.
So fascinating. So what can we do to support those 20 somethings? Yes, or maybe early 30 somethings. Yes, since that's, as you said, it's kind of a lot of these markers, right, in emergent adulthood or getting later and later, to feel more engaged at work, to want to stay. What speaks to them?
Yeah. So I usually talk about, and I do this through different stories and different ways to showcase this that obviously I can't do within a shorter period of time. But what I try to get down to is one motivating factor that I believe for millennials, and I think for Gen Z, I think this really transfers over, is what I call a fear of insignificance. So I really believe, especially for millennials and Gen Z, that they're really driven in a lot of ways, when I look at a lot of data, by a fear of insignificance. And again, I don't think this is necessarily a generational thing. I think everybody wants to feel valued, important, significant. But I definitely see even a bigger shift for millennials, and I think even more Gen Z, this idea that they want to feel like they're doing something that's important. And they want to feel like they are an important part of doing something important. So anytime that a millennial Gen Z starts to feel insignificant, their role, in the relationships, their voice that's not heard, they don't feel like they're a part of anything, or they just can't seem to understand the why, of your organization. And we've heard this a lot before, but really understanding, okay, what's important about this? Why are we doing what we're doing? Why is this important to maybe my values? What are my values? We hear some of these conversations that we maybe wouldn't have heard previously, where it was just like, well, you go to work to do work and you show up to make money. And who cares about any of those questions? Well, millennials and Gen Z are saying, no, I really do care about our product and even some of the bigger social issues, obviously, especially for Gen Z. We're seeing that shift where social issues are important to them. And how does your organization respond to those? So really we have to then speak to, okay, how do you then show significance to millennials and Gen Z? Is that even your role? Is that your job as a manager or a leader? Should you be worried about that or not? And so that's a conversation to be had.
It is an important conversation to be had. I think, as you said, for anybody in an organization to feel that they're valued, that they're, what they're bringing is something that's making a difference. And it seems like it's especially important, as you said, because there isn't as much stickiness for that age range group to stay there if they're not feeling significant or valued or so on. So, what about, if we were to shift a little bit more focus to those that are a little bit older, so the millennials, what are you seeing as some of the biggest issues in the companies that you work with? And what can individuals do to help those in their teams, again, to feel more like a part of the community?
Yeah, I think, one thing that I think a lot of companies are wrestling with or trying to better figure out is this idea of, work-life balance, like you said. Obviously that's becoming more and more a part of our reality of how do we balance these things. But I would even go beyond work-life balance. I don't even know if work-life balance necessarily exists anymore.
Mhm.
I think it's more work-life integration. So how are we integrating work and life seamlessly, where they almost are happening at the same time? And with the technologies that we have, and then with COVID maybe shifting some paradigms, and with working at home becoming more of a reality, still kind of in the flux of how do we figure all this out in a post-COVID world. I think that question of work-life integration becomes an important one, especially for millennials who have a high value for, family, and I do see that millennials really value that. So you could have a millennial that's doing really well skill wise, that's really succeeding as a manager. And you might even give them a raise, a promotion. That's kind of the next step. We want this person to step more into a leadership role. Um, but that millennial, you might actually just have started the countdown for now how quickly that millennial leader is going to leave, because they're looking at their bosses, and they're looking at the lack of work-life balance or healthy work-life integration in their lives. They're looking at broken families. They're looking at what the culture is. That we, clock in at this hour, we clock out. We're the last ones to leave. 70 hours a week. Put your head down. That kind of mantra, and that's totally fine. I mean, if that's the culture, and you feel like people need to hold on to that, that's your choice. That they just need to toe the line and do that. But I just usually try to at least paint the picture with leaders that a millennial might say, you know what, I have a lot of other options, and I don't want to just see my kids for 15 minutes before they go to bed. And this value of mine is really not being met. And so at least having these questions that are value-based conversations and being talked about this, I think is really a crucial and important one, because you might not really even be paying attention as a leader to some of the underlying issues that are taking place. And they might be value-based issues of your employees and staff that feel like their values are being contradicted or conflicted all the time. But there's never been an open conversation about this or an understanding. And so then they might just leave without even having that conversation with you. So it's just some of these kind of things are important ones that will start. Okay, how do we start redefining? Okay, what does success, what does meaning, what does significance look like for millennials and Gen Z?
Such important questions to ask anybody that you work with, of course. And it's true. Oftentimes we don't pause to ask those kinds of questions. What is most important for you here? We make assumptions, and those assumptions might not be true. And so how about if we kind of flip this now the other direction? What if somebody listening is within the Gen Z or millennial, kind of range?
Mm-hmm.
What do they need to know to support them to experience the most fulfillment and success in their life?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and that's what my life has been. A lot of books towards it. 101 Secrets to Your 20s, 101 Questions You Can Ask in Your 20s, because I'm really passionate about helping younger leaders succeed, and even changing their mindset and perspective of, okay, something as simple as, one of my phrases that I'll say a lot is that success really in your 20s is more about setting the table than enjoying the feast. So I think one generational characteristic, especially with how fast everything is moving these days, how everything is at all of our fingertips. So I think really Gen Z and millennials are kind of predisposed to think success, career fulfillment, living the life of my dreams should come as quickly, and especially within my job. And so I'm constantly trying to remind millennials and Gen Z is really, no, we're just trying to set the table correctly right now. So that when the feast does come, when success starts to happen, you have a table strong enough to hold it up. Because again, it might not necessarily even be a skill set. you need to grow in your skills. You need to harness those, but there's also a character issue. There's values issue. So again, you have to grow those. That's an important part of growing up as well and becoming successful is having character, humility, authenticity, some of these things so that you can become a better leader. Well, a lot of those are, those are harnessed and grown in maybe in difficult situations. And so what I'm typically trying to tell millennials and Gen Z, even if you don't feel like your job is the best, I want you to ask yourselves, well, are you giving your job the best? And I really want you to focus on that, because if you decide, well, I just need to quit this job because they don't get me, or I'm not feeling this, or whatever the reason is, well, guess what you're going to step into next? You're going to step into another lousy job because you didn't go through the hard work of trying to figure out, okay, I need to grow this skill set. I need to learn this lesson. I need to have this conversation with my manager so that I can learn some conflict resolution, these kind of things that you can then take to your next job. So some of these aspects that are age-old truths, really, but it's just the reminding of this to say, hey, I don't want you emailing the CEO of the company within 3 months saying, where's my promotion? Some of these stereotypes. Let's have more of a long-term vision of what career growth and success looks like.
Mm. And it is really a gift, I think, to be able to offer that perspective, because, some may say that those generations, maybe things came to them a little more easily than perhaps some of the other generations. And, that they really can benefit from building that resilience, as you said, oftentimes from hardships, hard situations. So sticking with it and learning how to grow through it is really something that does need to be harnessed. So I appreciate that. And this could also be true for other generations. Yes, in terms of when they experience hardships, let's say even in relating to the younger generations, right? To really be patient, to really set the table, so to speak, for those relationships, to be able to be more, to offer more of a mentoring role if that's valued, right? To help them, not just expect of them. Yes, because they didn't grow up the way that they did, right? That these older generations did. So
yeah, exactly. And the beautiful thing about cross mentoring, and I know it's not a mentoring conversation, but I mean, a lot of us have seen the studies or seen the data. But I was thinking of a Wharton study that I saw where they studied mentoring relationships within an organization, and they found a 20% increase in retention of the mentee and the mentor. So it really holds that value. Again, as we're talking about significance and how I think older leaders, older employees, they want significance too. And that's, again, a great way to have built-in significance for both sides and to build trust is to have those, at least those opportunities. And now how you structure that, how you go about creating these mentoring opportunities, that's another conversation. But it is so vital, not just for the people being mentored, but the mentees as well, like you said.
And it also helps to collapse limiting beliefs, because if we may have some stereotypical belief or mindset about a group of people, once you get to know them and work with them and understand why they do the things they do and how they think and so on, then a lot of those, assumptions just kind of dissolve, and it's human to human. Let me help you, you help me, and we can uplift one another because we all have gifts. So we can teach one another, right? As a good team would. So I know that you mentioned mentorship is a whole other conversation, and I agree with that. And if there's just a couple of tips that you can give to somebody who's listening that says, what, that's a really cool idea. I want to bring that into my team or my organization. What are a couple of starting points?
Yeah, I would say a great one that anyone can implement quickly, that just off the top of my mind right now. And on my screen, if I was doing this a keynote, I would show a plastic spork right now is what I would show as kind of my visual for this metaphor. But basically my argument would be something simple anybody can do. It doesn't cost anything, is to invite younger employees, maybe even somebody that you want to mentor, into what I say, invite them to the adult table. And so what I mean is there's a lot of millennials and Gen Z that feel like in your organization, they're sitting at the kids' table, right? And they're there with the plastic sporks, because you don't trust them with the real silverware. You don't trust them with the knives. So they need to sit at the side table with the plastic sporks. So what I say is, well, invite somebody that you want to, get to know better, you want to harness their ability, and invite them to sit at the adult table. Meaning, let's say you have a big meeting coming up, an important meeting. You might go to this younger employee and say, you know what, we have this big meeting coming up. I know that you know about it. You weren't, I know you weren't on the invite list. I want to specifically invite you. And I know you haven't even had time to prepare. You don't even know what the meeting's about. And really, that's not the point. I actually don't even want you don't even feel like you have to say anything. I just want you to come into the room and I want you to listen for me, because I'm going to be busy. I'm going to be talking. There's going to be a lot going on in the room. I just want you to be my eyes and ears. I want you to really pay attention for me about what you perceive going on in this meeting. And so you'll go to the meeting, you'll do that, and you'll come back. And obviously, we know how that will end up. That younger employee is going to feel already so valued, so seen and heard. Well, I was important enough that they specifically invited me into this meeting. And so that right there already is building that kind of mentoring type relationship, but within the context of day-to-day life at work. It doesn't have to be this special thing where you go on a retreat together and do goat yoga together and talk about your feelings. It can be in the context of day-to-day life, and it doesn't have to cost a thing.
Such a cool metaphor of the spork, and a really great simple example, because it is the little things. Sometimes I imagine it's even just kind of pausing to ask some questions, get to know a person a little bit better, for no reason other than just to get to know them a little bit better, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're all part of the same bigger family, and why not, right? And then when the time comes for more work-related conversations, asking for their input, there's a little bit more rapport, there's more safety, there's more trust, and it just comes more easily from both sides. So what else do we need to know now from the lens of like hiring, attracting, Gen Zs and millennials? Like, what can hiring managers, leaders do to be the place of choice?
Oh, man, that's a good question. And I think it's an important place to start, because a lot of times I'll be brought in, or our organization will think they want to bring me in to talk about how do we sell or market to millennials and Gen Z better, right? Because we have a product problem and we want our product to move. And younger people don't seem to be buying our product or our service or whatever it might be. But what you just said is a great place to start, because I'll often tell an organization, well, I can tell you how good and effective you are with your marketing and sales by how good and effective you are with your retention rates, because those two are so closely aligned. And if you're not able to retain millennials and Gen Z effectively in your organization, I can almost guarantee you're not going to be doing a great job selling and marketing to millennials and Gen Z, because one, you don't have any of them in the room. So how can you dictate message and communicate and do branding and all of that without some of those voices and those perspectives in the room? So I would say, really, it's an age-old thing, but I would say, what story is your organization telling? Are you telling a honest and significant story? And then, do you all do what you say you do? And again, this is leadership 101, but consistency, authenticity, where a millennial and Gen Z can see very clearly that this organization or this leader is really who they say they are. Because for millennials and Gen Z, they're going to come in with a little bit of jadedness. I like to say that their BS radar is very fine-tuned, because they have been marketed to, they've been sold. There's more images and messages coming to them than ever before. So they've really built up this defense mechanism. And then also they've seen what the last 10 years have been like, of political scandals and fights, and they're on Twitter, they're on all these things. So they're going to again come with a lack of trust into the meeting. So if you can try to just show them, that this is who we are, this is the story we're telling, this is our why, this is the purpose, this is why we're all here. And this is how we walk the walk. And you got to start showing that through even having them shadow other employees. You got to have kind of an open book. Yeah, because if you're trying to hide things and protect things, and you really know that this is your vision statement, but you also know that no one actually takes into account into the vision statement, everybody thinks it's a joke. Well, again, they're going to instantly feel that disconnect. And so really we have to be paying attention to these core values, these core messages, who we are, and is this actually true? And so it's almost like internal branding. What's your internal brand? Let's not worry about your external brand. Let's focus on your internal brand. Because also all those jaded coworkers, they all talk. They're all on websites telling everybody what you're really about. None of this information is hidden anymore. So it's a really important thing to focus on.
Wow. And it's important to focus on it again for everyone, right? Because if there is some self-cleansing that needs to happen, right? Some shifting of behaviors, and then it's healthy for everyone. And it's just a good reminder of how important that is to be true to our why, right? To know our why, and then of course to live into it.
And for leaders, I think it's a shift, not to dive into this more, but to be honest even about your weaknesses or where you're struggling or what the process you're going through is a shift. I think it's a real shift in leadership dynamics. We wouldn't have seen that 20, 30, 40 years ago. I like to use the example even Franklin D. Roosevelt. And obviously this is way back. This is the 1940s. But I like to use this visual image of, that we know now that Franklin D. Roosevelt was in a wheelchair, but no one was allowed to take photos of him in a wheelchair when he was president because they didn't want, again, the perceived weakness, as they called it, which obviously we would not see that these days as that, but that's what they felt. And so they wouldn't let photographers take pictures of him. And so most of America never knew that he was in a wheelchair. But now that has totally flipped. And especially for younger people, for them to trust your strengths, you must be honest with your weaknesses. They already know that it's there. Again, you're not fooling anybody that you're not perfect. They know that, and they'll talk to employees that will tell them that. So again, the more you don't have to share all your dirty laundry, but the more that you're able to let them into the process to say, you know what, I messed up here. I'm sorry. This was my bad. Bringing some of those vulnerable, authentic elements. Well, that's again going to attract a younger person, especially because they're going to be like, oh man, I can actually trust this person. If they're telling me these things, man, I can actually trust that they are who they say they are. So again, a shift in perceived weakness and strengths for younger people.
Yeah, thank you. So, Paul, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share with us maybe just kind of one piece of advice, some juicy thing that you want people to know in the different generations. Let's start with the Gen Zs. Would you like to start with? That seems
Sure.
to be okay. What might be the kind of juiciest insights, advice that you have for them?
No, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I would just remind them that I think it's great to have big dreams and big goals and to be optimistic about your future. I think that's all important traits to have. So I don't think that could be the issue. The issue, and something we should focus on, is that it's how quickly we think, again, we're going to see the fruit of these big dreams and goals and our optimism. So again, it's really consistency. That's going to be such a crucial element in you doing good, effective, important work. There's a lot of people with great ideas, but there's not a lot of great ideas out there because you have to be very consistent and you have to be willing to even embarrass yourself. And so I'm constantly reminding younger people that the possibility for greatness and embarrassment, they both exist in the same space. You can't really do one without the other. And in today's social media world, it's really tough, I think, they don't want to, Gen Z doesn't want to look foolish. They don't want to look like they don't have it together. They don't want to look like they failed. They don't want to share these things. And so they're tucking them away. But it's totally part of that process. If you feel like you failed, that's normal. So that's what I would tell Gen Z.
Awesome. How about from millennials?
Yeah, millennials, you're becoming all grown up, right? That's my website, All Grown Up, GROAN up. So All Grown Up. I say it's punderful. But for millennials, millennials are entering in now a unique stage of life for them where they're stepping into leadership positions, where they are, raising kids, they have a house, they're becoming more full-fledged, adults. And so, for millennials, I would say, yeah, how are you? I'd say the advice is, really be intentional and pay attention to where your attention is being placed. And I think especially now with how much we are all on our phones, and that's my new book, Listen to Your Day, The Life-Changing Practice of Paying Attention. That's really my focus is, are we placing our attention to those places that we say are important? And I think for millennials who have now are kind of, they grew up with a little bit of technology, but then it was introduced. I think a lot of millennials are getting more and more addicted to just jumping on our phones as our reflex response for any boring, awkward, uncomfortable down moment. And so I would just encourage millennials to say, you know what, where should your attention be focused? Is looking at your phone, 4, 5, 6 hours of the day the best use of your time?
How about for Gen X/boomers?
Yeah, tough for me to say, because I'm kind of a zennial, so I guess I kind of have one foot. I'm like an old millennial. I don't even know what I am anymore. So I can give a little bit of advice there. Um, I would say for Gen X and boomers, the more that you can seek to understand young people in your office, and it can be frustrating and it's going to be trying, and it's going to take you taking an intentional effort to get to know, I would say, the younger people. But if you spend that time and you take that effort and you really try to pay attention to those people in your office, it's going to be a fruitful endeavor. You're going to get so much learning, so much insight. You'll have a better understanding, and maybe you'll even be able to grow in patience and see, okay, now I can see a little bit more why they think like this or why they're responding in this way. So even, taking some just because stop-ins to offices around your organization. I know we're all busy, but people are such an important part of your organization, no matter what organization it is. So just because stop-ins, just saying, I just want to stop in, I just want to say hi, I just want to get to know you, kind of like what we said before, it's going to go such a long way in really growing leaders, and then also helping your understanding, so you don't have to feel like you're pulling your hair out every time you're trying to collaborate with the younger person in your organization.
Wow. It made me kind of think back to my own mentors when I was younger, in my, early 20s, mid 20s, working, and people that kind of took me under their wing, introduced me to things, and it has made such a difference, really. And I'm still in touch with many of those individuals still to this day. And I think that what you shared is also true in the home, right? Taking the time to not, to pay more attention to the younger people in our own families, to really get to know them, at that deeper level. As a mom, sometimes I forget to do that. And when I do remember to do that, and I take the time to do that, it is so fulfilling and just marvelous.
Yeah, it's, we often, I'll often hear older generations especially talk about the selfie movement, with Gen Z and millennials taking selfies and how narcissistic they are, but I like to, and I write about this in my new book, Narcissus. He fell in love with his own image, the reflection in the water, and that was his issue, is falling in love with his own image. Millennials and Gen Z, I don't see, that's not the motivation for selfies. It's not because they're so obsessed with their own image. I really think it's because they have this, they're making a cry of, please someone see me, please someone hear me. I want to be valued. I want that validation, and that's what all those likes are, is I'm worthy, I'm seen, I'm heard. So yes, for leaders, for parents, the more that you can help fill that gap, it's not your responsibility to save anybody, but the more that you can be intentional about saying, I see you, I hear you, I'm paying attention to you, I think the more that they'll be able to just be in their own skin and feel cared about. And if I'm doing a keynote, I have a whole story that sometimes can bring people to tears in relating this issue, but I can't do it now. but just for people that this is really important. That definitely, when I'm trying to get to the heart of things, that's a real one for me that really tugs at my heartstrings, even as I'm talking about it now.
Yeah, I mean, I want to reach into the computer and just give you a big hug for saying that, because I think that's the one universal thing is that we don't feel that we are enough. And I think that that is something that we can give to one another through genuine care, compassion,
Mhm.
curiosity, and care. So, really, all my appreciation for you today, Paul. And how can people learn more about your awesome keynotes, your everything else that you have to offer?
Yeah, they can come to paulangone.com is one place. And Angone is Angone, Angone. If you try to Google it, I'm sure you'll stumble across me. But I have different clips from both my keynotes giving to young employees or college students, but also keynotes that I've given to Gen X and boomers and leaders. So you'd see clips and reels if you just want to get a better feel for what it's like seeing some more information that I share on stage. Also, allgrownup.com is another resource. If you're maybe if you're a Gen Z millennial, that's probably your spot to go. And you can find free chapters from all my books at allgrownup.com. Again, GROAN, groaning, you're groaning in pain. The growing pains are built into the name. And you can find me on social media, Instagram, LinkedIn at Paul Angone again. The hardship of having a unique last name. It makes you unique, but hard to spell in these situations. But
Well, I'm sure they will find you. And again, really deep thanks for doing the work that you do, just spreading more love across the generations. And
well,
of
thank you.
course, for being with us today.
Of
All
course, thank
that's
you. It was
great.
an honor. Great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.